Hopefully you remember from last week, the beginning of the book of Ruth, where we read that little tiny paragraph and we realized, man, there was a lot of stuff packed in there. These people whose names had significance left the place of promise to seek pleasure elsewhere. And what did they find? Pain, sickness, and death, and grief. And so we left last week with Ruth and Naomi coming back to the land of promise after what seems like all the promise of their life has been stripped away. And that's a hard place to be. If you remember at the end of last week, Naomi was saying, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because God has made my life bitter. She didn't see her family's sin as the cause of her pain. She saw God's heart as the cause of her pain. And when we get to that place in life, it's hard to see a ray of sunshine or hope anywhere. And that was absolutely the case. Even when Ruth said, I'm not going anywhere, I'm sticking with you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Where you die, I will die. And where you are buried, I will be buried. I'm with you till the end, girl. She just says, all right, whatever. I mean, that's a dark place. Where when someone pledges their life to you, and like, I'm with you through thick and thin, we got this, for there to be no connection with your heart that's really true. Why? Because if God has abandoned you, then how could you trust anybody else? It's understandable how people get there. I know people in our church family who have gone through seasons like that. It's tough. But today, the story starts to change and take a new shape. Ruth's hope, commitment, hesed, her loyalty, her faithfulness is going to start to become Naomi's, and I think, by God's grace, it'll start to become yours as well. So I want to pick up the story in the last verse of chapter 1, and then we're going to work through chapter 2. It begins like this, verse 22 of chapter 1. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. God's already working in the next line. Zoom in on a particular space. Ruth 2:1. Now, there was a wealthy and influential man, the text reads, a man of standing, in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. What we should be reading in that line is the writer of the scriptures telling us a little bit of historical context so that we see the hope before the characters in the story do. It's this awesome, like authors get to do that, right? Give you a little sneak preview. Here's how it continues. One day, Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. Let me just stop right there just for a second. What is Ruth asking Naomi to allow her to do? She's asking her if she can do something that's actually encouraged in the Old Testament called gleaning. There was a practice where if you planted fields, you were not supposed to, by God's law and mandate, harvest all the way to the edges. You were supposed to leave a little bit along the walkways, and anything that falls down, you weren't supposed to pick it up. It was supposed to be left for people who were less fortunate. It was an ancient welfare program. Jesus and his disciples do this in the Gospels. They're gleaning, remember when? On the Sabbath. As if people shouldn't be able to get food on the Sabbath. He actually essentially says that to the Pharisees. So she is trying to make use of a God-ordained way for her who is poor and has no resources to still provide for herself and her mother-in-law. It's like a way, it's not a handout. It's a biblical hand up. She's asking, can I go and do this if anyone will let me? And what does that tell you? That tells you that a lot of people are ignoring God's law to leave some of their fields unharvested. Why? They want all the money. I worked hard. I earned this. This is mine, and I'm going to keep it for myself and my own. What does God say? You work hard to steward the resources I have given you. I send the rains. I produce the growth. The crop is mine, Take the portion I give you and be happy, and leave the rest for people less fortunate. But lots of people aren't doing that. You know who is? A man of standing named Boaz. So can I go out, which would be her really asking, like, is this even appropriate? Because we're in Judah now. This is foreign and familiar. She's a Moabite. Around Bethlehem, hey, Naomi, can I go out and glean so that we can have something to eat? Like, there's no panhandling. She can't go out and hold a sign and say, help me. This is the way that she has available. And so what does Naomi say? All right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. Listen to this. As it happened, no line has been less telling or truthful. As it happened, by happenstance, circumstance, it's a coinky-dink, she found herself working in the field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. We'll find out why that's so important shortly. But that's already quite the coincidence, isn't it? Of all the fields, she happens to go to a relative she's never heard of or seen before. So let me ask you the question. Do you think, as the text says, she just happened to find herself in that field? Remember last week where we put up the graph and there was an Old Testament, or like an ancient worldview and a modern one? Where the modern worldview, it was all about us and human action and we cause everything. But in the ancient worldview, they thought God was the primary cause and things that happened around us had spiritual value and importance as the first line of significance. Let me just tell you, not a single person who has read the first few lines of the book of Ruth in ancient Israel would have thought this was a coinky-dink, okay? This is tongue-in-cheek. It just so happened, and everyone's like, yeah, okay, so we know who made it happen. Yahweh is doing something special behind the scenes. And I just want you to know today, this is a really low point for Naomi and Ruth. She's literally having to say to her likely elderly mother-in-law who probably can't provide for himself or herself, we're broke, we're going to starve to death unless you let me go out and risk my life. Because people like to steal women off the side of fields in the middle of nowhere. To provide for myself, can I do this? This is this is the bottom of the barrel. At her darkest point, God was positioning her for more. I want you to know today, if your circumstance feels bleak, God is moving behind the scenes in a way that you might not yet see or be willing to give him credit for. But that's what he does. And so this has a doctrinal or theological definition. It's a word, Barb, you brought it up a couple classes ago. It's called providence. Providence is the way that God aligns creation with his will. And this can happen a lot of different ways, and people have different theologies of providence, but most simply put, it's the way that God is moving behind the scenes or overtly to have us and this world do what he wants. So just by happenstance, God has made it be a coinky-dink that Ruth is gleaning in the field of the exact person when she has nothing who could give her everything. God's pretty good at doing stuff like that, and he might be doing that in your life as well. But it involves something. Some people think that providence means God makes everything that ever happens happen. So anything like a roll of a dice, God predetermined the 6. That's God's providential action. I think that's actually a pretty naive and too simple way to think of it. A lot of people think that makes God really powerful. I kind of think it makes him too simple. And I don't think he's really that simple because our world isn't simple. And I don't know about you, my life doesn't feel so simple all the time. God's doing things a little bit differently. There's more artistic, there's more flow, there's cool things going on. And what we learn from the scriptures, especially from this point, but so many other places, is God likes to use us, our human freedom, and our actions to bring about his will in the world. You and your freedom have the ability to frustrate God's will or give birth to new possibilities with God's will. That's crazy. You know what Paul calls that? Being a co-minister with Christ. A co-reconciler. You have amazing spiritual power and authority to do what God has asked you to do and to utilize God-ordained means for him to bless you. What is Ruth doing here? She is understanding providence, I think, rightly. That God acts oftentimes through our actions by guiding things behind the scenes. Ruth doesn't say, all right, what we really need to do, Naomi, because we've got nothing, is to go into a room and pray until someone knocks on our door and gives us money. That's not what they say. She doesn't even write a letter somewhere else. They're not in the prayer closet saying, God, we're just going to stay here until you feed us. We're expecting manna from heaven, right? God has done those things, and he certainly can. And you probably have stories where you or people you know, right when you're at the bottom of your dollar, somebody wrote you a check and it showed up in your mail and it was just what you needed. You hear those stories all the time. But there's action involved. Ruth, rather than just sitting and waiting for God to make a way, decides to use God-ordained means to be the way that God provides for her. This is a little trippy, but this is a theology of work. Adam and Eve in the garden were not created to sit around and be fanned by animals and eat grapes all day. What does God do? Steward the garden. Work it. Make it beautiful. Be creative. God ordained work for us, which may sound trippy. Now, we should understand work is not like it was supposed to be. In fact, God even says this, when you work the ground moving forward, it's going to be hard, right? Because sin has entered into the equation. So when you have a bad day at work, I don't think God ordained that. But I think God did actually create you to work. And as we work with God through the ways that he has says, this is what I want you to do, he can bless us. What does this look like for Ruth? She doesn't sit and pray. She says, I know the scriptures say I can glean. God has made a way for me to work hard and be partnered with his grace and his love to change our circumstances. This is not a God helps those who helps himself theology. This is a God is in everything and is asking you to just put a little bit of effort and trust in him. So she's gleaning. She's not too proud for it. She's not hiding. She gets out and says, I'm going to work to change my life for the better in ways that God has says I should. I'm not cheating the system. I'm not stealing. I'm not trusting in things other than God. I'm going to trust in a means of provision that God has said is good, and I'm going to work. What does that mean for your life? Well, it means that you should probably actually do a little bit of work and stop complaining about your circumstances and utilize God-given opportunities to change them. Also, think about this. Naomi is probably too old to be out in the fields, too sketched for her, especially in the heat of the day. So who can go? Ruth. Does she love that idea? Probably not. I'm telling you, there's not a lot of young folks in the room today, but a lot of young folks don't like hard work. And what they want to do is have Naomi go in the field for them. This is an important model. If you have adult men sleeping in your house, eating all of your food, there's obviously crisis moments, and we should be good parents and good neighbors and everything else, but the system is reversed in our world in painful ways. And I know some of you have suffered with this for generations. Generations. Where dad doesn't want to go to work, but he still drops off kids with grandma. Okay? I'm not up here to chastise anybody today, but I'm saying we have flipped the roles. And we've asked Naomi's to do the hard work so that Ruth's can play video games and eat pizza rolls in basements. And that's not the way God designed it to be done. Okay? People grow up, and they need to be able to actually participate in God's economy of grace, which involves hard work. If you're mama and grandma and you're still caring for adult children, I feel for you. And sometimes it's necessary. Circumstances are tough. But I also think we live in a world where there should be more Ruths at work than Naomi's. I think it's pretty clear. So Ruth gets out of the pity poor me party, takes off the video game headset, and goes to work to bring home food for her mother-in-law who needs her help. If only more people did that today. And you know what happens when she does? This is what's trippy. God meets her there and blesses her. This seems so patently obvious, I shouldn't have to say it from a platform in a church service. But we're so twisted in this, in our theology of work and our expectations of different generations today, that we need to understand God's vision for provision with Ruth and young, able-bodied people, regardless of the circumstances. She's at the lowest of the low. If you're at the lowest of the low today, God has grace for you, but he's also providing a way for you to make more by his grace. She goes out, she works hard, and God meets her there. Here's the story. I'll stop just attacking it. Verse 4. While she was there doing this work, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he says. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters reply. And then Boaz asked his foreman, because there's a strange person on site, right? Who's that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? Like, what's up? Is she stealing? Do we need to stop her, right? And the foreman replies, "She's the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters," which is the principle of gleaning, which should be allowed by Jewish law. And listen, she's been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. Like, she was getting after it, and her hard work was noticed. We have lost the value of hard work today, and we wonder why God doesn't bless us. Ruth works hard. Rather than sitting and complaining about her circumstances, asking for a handout, next to restaurants that have "we're hiring for $15 an hour" in the window, in the corner of 26 and 65. Come on. And I want you to know that people still value hard work today like they did back then as well. And it's not always the case in all places, because sin is in the equation. But if you work hard, show up on time, and ask for God's help to be like kind to your coworkers and actually listen to your authority at work, if you are regular and you are a hard worker, God tends to bless you. It's not a like A plus B equals C. It's not like if you work hard, God's going to give you $1 million. I'm not saying that. I'm saying God created you to work, and when you do it with godliness, God appreciates that. And he cares for the people that he loves. She's been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. God uses Ruth's willingness to work hard to meet her and bless her. Verse 8. Boaz went over and said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, stay here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they're harvesting, and then follow them. I warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you're thirsty, help yourself to water they have drawn from the well." What is she saying, or what is he saying to her? It might get lost. He is saying to a young woman who is dangerously precarious on the fringe of society, for whom bad things could happen to her, who's working hard to try to help her mother-in-law, he's saying this: your wandering days are over. Stay. Don't leave. Here, there might still be some hardship, but you will find the provision you need. Not all who wander are lost, because God's doing some directing behind the scenes. And it may be hard for us to sympathize with this. Maybe you can. But in this moment, the text, you can read the weight falling off of Ruth's shoulders, because she's carrying a household in a way she never envisioned her life. She thought she was going to have a husband who took care of her, and she was going to be able to have kids, which was the joy of a woman in this day and age. Maybe different today, but it was then. Her whole life is different than she expected. She's out in the hot sun harvesting grain in a foreign land, and there are a bunch of guys catcalling at her. What does Boaz say? Stay here. You'll have all that you need, and you'll be safe. Verse 10. Ruth fell at his feet. I'm telling you. Fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness? I'm only a foreigner." You've probably been in this position before. Like, what do I deserve this? God's provision. God making a way. And he says, Yes, I know. But I also know about everything you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. He knows her history and her story. I have heard how you left your father and your mother in your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done. What is Boaz telling Ruth? I hope it's the same thing the Holy Spirit is telling you today, that God has seen your devotion to him. And he has seen the way that you have begged for his help. And he has seen the way that you got up and laced up your bootstraps even when you were confused and scared and didn't know what was going on. The way that even when you made poor decisions, you felt like you were doing the best you could in the moment. He has seen your faithfulness. And he is going to provide because he is Jehovah Jireh. And when you seek shelter under his wings, it's literally the image of like a hen protecting her eggs or her chicks with their wings, right? Like you're going to find the comfort and the help and the provision you need. In fact, in this text where he says, may the Lord reward you fully, the text actually is saying, it's the verbal version of the word shalom. What is shalom in Hebrew? Peace, like full and complete peace. The kind of thing that all of us are seeking and none of us seem to completely find. The kind of thing that is promised in the New Testament with the presence of the Holy Spirit, a peace that transcends all understanding. What Boaz actually says to her is, because of your commitment to God and what you have done, may that peace that you've been looking for be totally displayed in your life. All the faithfulness you've shown others, may it be paid back to you. May God make in you complete, restored peace. I wonder if there's anybody here today who needs some restored peace. Her hard work is being rewarded. There's also wordplay here between the Hebrew words for favor and grace, which there's a distinction. What Ruth is asking for, both with Naomi and with Boaz, is favor. I know I don't deserve it. I just need a little bit of help, and then I can handle it on my own. Right? You've needed a favor from somebody. What Boaz offers isn't a favor, it's grace. It's, I know that you don't necessarily think you need more, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. I'm not just going to give you the little bit you asked. I'm going to give you more than you could have ever imagined. This is why Boaz is considered prefiguration for Christ in the New Testament. Because what does Jesus do? We ask him for mercy and a favor, right? The favor of the Lord. God, look on me, not with disdain. Forgive me my sins. I don't want to go to hell is the way we usually think about it, right? What does Jesus say? He says, okay, we can deal with that, but how about some more? How about rather than an enemy, I call you a son or daughter? How about rather than just erasing the guilt of sin, I give you a new nature so that you don't even want to sin anymore? How about rather than simply being somebody who benefits from a social program, I make it so that you can help other people? God gives you so much more in Jesus than you could ever ask or imagine. And in this moment, Ruth is receiving so much more from Boaz than she would have ever thought or imagined. And what's being communicated to her is not just that Boaz sees her, but it's that God has seen her the whole time. The person who's conspicuously absent, though, is Naomi, who is the real person who's having a hard time trusting in God. But I want you to know today that in the same way, God is looking at you and he sees you. And he knows how hard you're trying. And you're not saved by your works. You're only saved by Jesus. But he does, in fact, reward us for the ways that we trust in him. And today, maybe, just maybe, you're seeking his favor because you need just a little bit of help. And maybe, just maybe, he wants to pour the floodgates on you and change your circumstances. Maybe it's breakthrough in your family or relationship, mentally. Maybe it's guilt from sin and shame. Maybe you genuinely need some kind of real fiscal provision. God's still in the business of doing those things today. It's madness, isn't it? The way that God richly blesses us. But it's grace. And he wants to pour it out. The story continues. Verse 13. I hope I continue to please you, sir. And that's probably the way that you'd respond to God as well when he offers you more than you want. You've comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I'm not even one of your workers. At mealtime, the grace keeps coming. Boaz called to her, come over here. Help yourself to some food. It's like the New Testament image of being like brought to the table of the Father again. Help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine. So she sat with the harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. Listen to this. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. God's provision for her is great in this moment and great continuing. When Ruth went back to work again, because she didn't just take that as, okay, God has shown up and now I can hit the pause button and be a lazy brat again. Like, no, I'm going to keep doing what God has called me to do. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered the young men, let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some barley head from the bundles that you've harvested and drop them on purpose for her, and let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time. He's literally saying, hey, see that woman out there? I want you to accidentally drop some grain, which by law you're not supposed to pick back up, so that she can pick it up and make it easy for her. It's amazing what God is blessing her with through this moment. And I 100% know it's the case, and I'm grateful for times that God has dropped grain in my lap. Like, there's been times where I've really worked hard for things that God has blessed me with, but there's been other times where I'm like, wow, that came out of nowhere. God, you're amazing. Thank you. I bet we could probably pass the mic around right now to some of you guys where God dropped provision in your lap when you weren't even asking for it. She was willing to work, and God gave it to her without any kind of like craziness. It's amazing. Oops, I guess Ruth is going to have to pick that one up. So Ruth gathered barley, verse 17, all day. And then she beat out the grain that evening, and it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from the meal. Which, can you imagine this moment? Naomi, who's probably still throwing a pity poor me fit, correct? I mean, we're not told that there's a long gap in between this. She's just got home. Ruth went out for the day to maybe, just maybe, find enough grain for them to not be hungry that night. Probably been hungry all day. She's probably sitting in whatever shelter she could find saying, God, why me? Why do you hate me? You've done this to yourself. Why have you put me in this situation? I don't deserve this, blah, 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 blah. Previously in chapter 1, she said, God hates me, and you should run away from God before he hates you too. Remember that? That was her perspective. Pity poor me. So she's probably still majorly in the dumps. We probably in the text should be calling her Mara because God has made her life bitter rather than Naomi. But she's addressed as Naomi because God is about to bring pleasure back into her life, and that's what her life means. Her name means. Verse 19. Can you imagine? This huge sack of grain propped in front of you, and then some that's cooked and ready to eat? It's like, what did you do to get that? There's probably some dark questions that come to her mind. Like, where did you gather all the grain today? Where did you work? Whatever it means, may the Lord bless the one who helped you, because I'm hungry, right? So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man whose field she had worked. And she says, she drops the name, which we already know. The man I worked with today was Boaz. So you can imagine Naomi probably hungry, stuffing her face with some of that roasted grain. And then she hears Boaz, and you could imagine it falling out of her mouth. Her just staring down for a second like, who? Boaz. Her response? May the Lord bless him. I imagine her saying this with her hand in her face. It's an exclamation point in the text, but you can have an exclamation point in your heart without it coming out of your mouth. May the Lord bless him. Naomi told her daughter-in-law, he is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives and one of our family redeemers, which means a lot. In this moment, God is giving birth to hope in her. She is seeing his work behind the scenes. Then Ruth said, what's more, Boaz told me to come back and stay with the harvesters until the entire harvest is complete. This wasn't a one-day meal. This is a meal ticket bought for a long time. And Naomi's like, good! Exclamation point! Do as he says, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in the fields, but you'll be safe with them. I don't have to worry about you going to work anymore. And I don't have to worry about being hungry. This is amazing. God is doing something astonishing. Now, my question for you, Is this the same Naomi from the end of chapter 1? Not even a little bit. Her tone, completely different. Rather than speaking ill of God and telling people to avoid him, she is saying, may God bless you and bless him. See, she's managed to see God's providence in all of this. What she perceived as pain, she is now seeing through the story of Ruth and Boaz, was actually God divinely positioning her for more. And I think he's doing that for you today as well. So let me just ask, how would your life change today if you saw the pain you're currently experiencing as positioning rather than punishment? Flip the script. Put on Naomi's eyes. Rather than feeling like God is punishing you for something, what if instead you saw it as divine positioning for the next thing that he wants to bless you with? I think that would change the way that you go home today and talk to your spouse. It would change the way you go to work on Monday. It might change the way you live entirely. This chance encounter is enough for Naomi to probably get up and run around in circles. Previously, she couldn't pray. She couldn't talk to God. She could only talk about him. Now she can pray and praise. It turns out that God hadn't given up on her, and he hasn't given up on you. Also, circumstantially, it's amazing what a full belly and a family reunion can do for your spirits. There's obviously more going on, though, and I just have a couple minutes to unpack it for you. Nestled in this text is a really, really important term, which matters for the next couple of sermons. In verse 20, Boaz is called a redeemer, the closest family relative, one who could redeem them. You've probably heard this preached on by other pastors, and that's great. It's already in your brain. The Hebrew here is a goel, and there's so many different ways that goels function, redeemers function in the Old Testament. Primarily, though, it was to keep track of and buy back family lands. The Old Testament vision for land ownership wasn't that it could just be bought and sold with prejudice. It was that God gave land as a promise to different clans and families. And the closest family relative was responsible for keeping that land in the family. Sure, you could lease it, sure, you could sell it, but a redeemer always had the right to buy it back. Naomi and family left their farm. They come back, they don't have farming no more. Who can get it back for them? Not just be provision for the day or for the season, but buy back the land for their whole family life? Boaz, the guy who she just happens to stumble upon his land. She is also, there's two ladies with no hope of continuing their family line. What good is it buying back the family farm if you don't have any young little guys to run around and tend it and hand it down to? Well, it just so happens that a goel also can redeem family lines, can marry a widow and produce an heir for her husband, according to Old Testament law. It's levirate marriage. It's super weird. I know that's weird for you. It's weird for me as well. But for her, it made perfect sense. He could, if God allowed this to happen by his providence. We haven't got that far in the story yet. But Naomi is thinking of all the possibilities. And that's all I want you to get today. Maybe if you change the way you look at your pain, you'll see possibilities instead. In that moment where Ruth says, you'll never guess who I got to hang out with today. It was Boaz. And the grain threw out of her mouth. Her brain was working way faster than her mouth could. My guess is she couldn't sleep that night because she was thinking of, what might God do next? He could have, in this one happenstance moment, changed our family forever. And sneak peek, he does. And sneak peek, Jesus comes from the family line. Man, what might God give birth to you today, in you today, if you were willing to see the difference in your pain, not as punishment, but positioning? I want to leave you with one quick note, though. Just because your perspective changed today doesn't mean your circumstances do. Okay? Don't leave out of here and said, Logan said, if I perceive my pain differently, I'm going to be able to pay my rent this month. That's not how that works. That's just not. Okay? But, you know what Ruth does? She keeps going back to work. She sees God's blessing her through a means that he has provided, and she stays hard at it. Today, stay hard at it. If God's giving birth to hope in you today, work hard. And God will see your work, and other people will as well. Here's how the text continues. They didn't have their circumstances change overnight. Verse 23, Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's field and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest and early summer, and all the while she lived with her mother-in-law. Her circumstances didn't change overnight, but her perspective did, and her perspective gave birth to possibilities through God's power. What might your change of perspective give birth to this week, this month, this year, and for generations to come by God's power if you walk in obedience and faithfulness?